In a Toronto jail cell in 1977, Keith Richards was facing 7 years in prison and planning his suicide. Then his cellmate, a 68-year-old convicted murderer, said something that saved Keith's life and changed rock and roll history forever. It was February 27, 1977, and Keith Richards had just been arrested at the Harbour Castle Hotel in Toronto. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police had found an ounce of heroin in his hotel room, enough to charge him with trafficking, which carried a minimum sentence of 7 years in a Canadian prison. For Keith, who had been battling heroin addiction for years, this wasn't just another drug bust. This felt like the end. He was 33 years old, and he believed his life was effectively over. They took him to the Don Jail, a Victorian-era prison in Toronto known for its brutal conditions and violent inmates. Keith was strip-searched, given an orange jumpsuit, and led down a long corridor of cells. The other inmates recognized him immediately. Some shouted his name, others hurled insults. One yelled, "Rockstar's gonna get what's coming to him in here!" Keith kept his eyes down, following the guard to his cell. The cell was small, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, with concrete walls, a single barred window, 2 metal bunks, and a toilet in the corner. And sitting on the bottom bunk was an old man. He had white hair, weathered skin, and pale blue eyes that seemed to see right through Keith. He looked up when Keith entered, but didn't say anything, just nodded once, then went back to reading a worn paperback book. "This is your cellmate," the guard said. "Joseph Walsh. Been here 18 years, life sentence for murder. He'll show you the ropes." The guard locked the cell door and walked away, leaving Keith standing there with his new reality. Keith climbed onto the top bunk without saying a word. He lay on his back, staring at the cracked ceiling, and tried not to think about 7 years in this place. 7 years without music, without freedom, without heroin to numb the pain he'd been running from his whole life. For the first 2 days, Keith and Joseph barely spoke. Joseph seemed content to read his books and leave Keith alone. Keith spent most of his time lying on his bunk, sweating through withdrawal, shaking, occasionally vomiting into the toilet. The heroin was leaving his system, and every cell in his body was screaming for it. But beneath the physical pain was something worse, a deep, crushing despair that made Keith think about ending it all. On the 3rd night, Keith couldn't sleep. The withdrawal was too intense, his mind too chaotic. Around 2 a.m., he heard Joseph's voice from the bunk below. "You planning to kill yourself?" Keith froze. He hadn't said anything out loud, hadn't told anyone what he was thinking. "What?" Keith finally said. "I can hear it in how you breathe," Joseph said calmly. "I've been in here 18 years. I've shared cells with dozens of men. I know the sound of someone who's decided to quit. You've got that sound." Keith didn't deny it. What was the point? "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'm thinking about it. 7 years in here? I'd rather die." Joseph was quiet for a moment. Then he said something Keith didn't expect. "That's the easy way out." Keith laughed bitterly. "Easy? You think killing myself is easy?" "Easier than living," Joseph said. "Easier than facing what you did, why you're here, who you've become. Death is simple. Life is the hard part." Keith climbed down from his bunk and sat on the edge of Joseph's bed. In the dim light coming through the cell window, he could see the old man's face clearly for the first time. There was something in those eyes, not judgment, not pity, just a kind of knowing. "You killed someone," Keith said. It wasn't a question. Joseph nodded. "I did. Shot a man during a robbery in 1959. I was 40 years old, drunk, desperate for money, pulled the trigger without thinking, and I've been in here ever since."
"Do you regret it?" Keith asked. Joseph looked at him like the answer should be obvious. "Every single day. But regret doesn't bring him back. Regret doesn't undo what I did. All I can do is live with it and try to be something better than the man who pulled that trigger." Keith was quiet, absorbing this. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you think your life is over," Joseph said. "You think 7 years in here means you're done. But I'm going to tell you something that took me 10 years in this cell to learn. Your life isn't over until you decide it is. You can use this time to destroy yourself, or you can use it to become someone worth being. Over the next several days, Joseph and Keith talked, really talked. Joseph told Keith about his life before prison, the drinking, the bad decisions, the moment when everything went wrong. He told Keith about his first years in prison, when he'd been angry and violent, fighting other inmates, getting thrown in solitary confinement. "I was so full of rage," Joseph said. "Rage at the system, at the judge, at the man I killed for being in the wrong place, but mostly rage at myself for being so stupid." "What changed?" Keith asked. Joseph smiled slightly. "I met an old con named Eddie. He was 75, been in prison for 40 years, and he was the happiest person I'd ever met. I couldn't understand it. How could someone who'd been locked up for 4 decades be happy? So I asked him, and Eddie said something I'll never forget. He said, 'Joe, prison is where my body lives, but my mind is free. They can lock up my body, but they can't lock up my thoughts, my memories, my ability to learn and grow. I've read 1,000 books in here. I've learned 3 languages. I've become a better man than I ever was on the outside. Prison gave me something the free world never did: time to figure out who I really am.'" Keith felt something shift inside him as Joseph told this story. "So you started reading," Keith said. Joseph nodded. "I started reading. Philosophy, history, poetry, science. I learned to play chess. I took correspondence courses. I turned this cell into a university, and I became my own teacher. And you know what I realized? Being in prison doesn't mean your life is over. It just means your life looks different than you planned." Keith thought about his own life, the drugs, the chaos, the constant running from something he couldn't name. "I don't know who I am without the music," Keith admitted. "Without the stage, without the band, without the drugs. That's all I've been for so long." Joseph looked at him with those penetrating eyes. "Then maybe that's what you need to figure out. Who is Keith Richards when you strip away everything else? Who are you at your core?" That question haunted Keith for days. Who was he at his core? He'd been Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones for so long that he'd forgotten there was a person underneath that identity. A person who'd picked up a guitar as a kid because it made him feel something real. A person who'd fallen in love with the blues because it spoke to something deep in his soul. Before the fame, before the drugs, before the persona, who was Keith? On the 6th night, Keith woke up at 3 a.m. from a nightmare. He'd dreamed about dying in this cell, forgotten and alone. He was breathing hard, sweating, on the edge of panic. That's when Joseph spoke from the bunk below. "Keith, listen to me. You think you're trapped in here. You think these walls are your prison. But the real prison is in your head. It's the belief that you can't survive without the drugs, without the chaos, without destroying yourself. That's the real cell you're locked in." Keith climbed down from his bunk again. "How do I get out of that cell?" he asked. "The same way I did. You stop running. You stop trying to escape yourself. You sit with who you are, all the ugly parts, all the broken parts, and you decide that even that person is worth saving. Even that person deserves a chance to become something better."
They talked until dawn that morning. Joseph told Keith about the concept of hitting rock bottom, how sometimes you have to lose everything to find out what really matters. He told Keith about the importance of having something to live for beyond yourself: family, art, purpose. He told Keith that the best revenge against despair is to build a life worth living. "You're a musician," Joseph said. "That's not just what you do. That's who you are at your core. The drugs, the arrests, the chaos, that's not you. That's just the noise. But the music, that's your truth. And as long as you can still make music, you have a reason to live." Something broke open in Keith that night. For the first time since his arrest, he started thinking about the future not as something to dread, but as something to build. He started thinking about getting clean, really clean, not just for a tour or an album, but for good. He started thinking about the music he still wanted to make, the songs that were still inside him, waiting to be written. Over the remaining days in jail, Joseph became Keith's teacher in ways no guitar legend ever had. He taught Keith about patience, about resilience, about finding meaning in suffering. He taught Keith that strength isn't about never falling down, it's about getting back up every single time. And most importantly, he taught Keith that your past doesn't have to define your future. On the 9th day, Keith's lawyer managed to get him released on bail. The charges would eventually be reduced thanks to a plea deal that required Keith to play a benefit concert for the blind. But as Keith was packing his few belongings to leave, he realized he didn't want to go. Not yet, not without saying a proper goodbye to Joseph. Keith sat on Joseph's bunk one last time. "I don't know how to thank you," Keith said. "You saved my life, you know that, right? If it wasn't for you, I would have found a way to end it in here." Joseph smiled. "You saved your own life, Keith. I just reminded you it was worth saving." Keith pulled out a piece of paper, the only thing he'd been allowed to write on during his stay, and handed it to Joseph. On it, Keith had written the lyrics to a song he'd been composing in his head for the past few days. It was called "Before They Make Me Run," and it was about survival, about refusing to give up, about running toward life instead of away from it. "This is for you," Keith said. "Thank you for teaching me that prison isn't the worst thing that can happen to someone. Giving up is." Joseph read the lyrics slowly, carefully. When he finished, his eyes were wet. "This is beautiful, Keith. You promise me you'll record this. You promise me you'll get out of here, get clean, and make this song, because people need to hear this. People need to know that you can hit rock bottom and still climb back up." Keith promised. They shook hands, and Keith walked out of that cell, out of the Don jail, back into the world. But he took Joseph's lessons with him. He got clean, really clean, for the first time in years. He recorded "Before They Make Me Run" for the Some Girls album in 1978, and every time he played it after that, he thought about Joseph Walsh, the convicted murderer who taught him that life was worth living. Keith tried to stay in touch with Joseph through letters, but the prison system made it difficult. Joseph was eventually transferred to another facility, and Keith lost contact with him. But in 1995, Keith was doing an interview in Toronto when the journalist mentioned that Joseph Walsh had died in prison 2 years earlier. Keith went quiet for a long time. Then he told the journalist the story of those 9 days in the Don jail and what Joseph had meant to him. The interview was published, and suddenly people wanted to know more about Joseph Walsh. Who was this convicted murderer who'd saved Keith Richards' life? Reporters dug into his story and found something remarkable. After his conversation with Keith, Joseph had started a prison education program, teaching other inmates to read and write. Over the 15 years between Keith's visit and his death, Joseph had helped over 200 inmates get their high school equivalency degrees. He'd become a model prisoner, a mentor, a teacher. Joseph's daughter, who Keith had never known existed, reached out to Keith after reading the interview. She told Keith that her father had kept the lyrics to "Before They Make Me Run" pinned above his bed for the rest of his life, that every time someone asked Joseph what he was most proud of, he'd point to those lyrics and say, "I helped save a life, and he helped save mine."